Welcome to How Griffith Knives Are Made, Part 2. This time we're going to go over how I grind my edges, stamping, and heat treating. First off though, about the audio in the last video, I left the shop radio on while I was recording, and that is a no-no because of copyright. So we're leaving the shop radio off in the future videos so that we don't have to cut out any more audio, because the super valuable commentary was lost in the first video. Just kidding, my commentary is probably not all that valuable. Also, if you have any questions, please feel free to post them in the comments section on YouTube or in the How Griffith Knives Are Made thread if you're on the forum. Now we'll jump right into grinding the edges. I grind my edges before I heat treat my knives, and that's a preference thing. You don't have to do it that way. Some guys like to grind their edges after the heat treat, and that's fine, as long as you do it all correctly. Grinding your edges after you heat treat the knife, you're going to remove more material, and if you're not careful about it, you'll overheat your blade and you'll ruin the temper. Grinding, it's also harder on your belts, by the way. Grinding your edges before heat treat, steel is softer, it's easier on your belts. However, you cannot grind it to an edge. If you grind it all the way to an edge and then you pull it out of your kiln and you dunk it in your quench tank, the chances of you warping that edge go way, way up. So when you grind your edges prior to heat treat, it's important to leave at least several thousandths of an inch flat. I've seen several different numbers on this. I prefer to leave slightly less than a dime's width. I prefer 0.05 inches. I've heard as few as 10 thousandths of an inch. So the way that I mark my edge before I grind it is with a pair of calipers, or a set of calipers. I take the stock thickness and subtract 0.05, and then I divide by 2. So this is a 5/32 inch blank, 0.1563 inches, and the calipers are set to 0.0532 inches. And the way that I do this is you set one toe of the caliper on the flat and the other toe where the edge is going to be, and you gently drag it down. This one's already been done, so I'm just going real easy. And then you do it on the other side as well. And what that does for you is that gives you two parallel lines that are pretty straight, very easy to see, and they have a nice space in between them. So that's how my edges are marked. Now when I grind them, Scandi edges, I use a couple of pieces of angle iron where it's clamped and it's flat and it sits upright, and then I move it by hand. Now convex, flat, anything else that I do is all done freehand. Scandivex edges, which, if you're not familiar with the term Scandivex, think of a convex Scandinavian grind. Scandivex grinds differ from full convex to zero grinds only in their height. Now, could I be wrong about that? Sure. But in my observations, that's the only difference, is the height of the grind. If the grind stops, less than a third the way up the blade, then it's a single bevel convex, it could be considered a Scandivex. If it goes way, way up, it could be a full convex. The difference, as far as I know, is only in the height of the grind. Now the way that I do those is I clamp them in the same jig that I use for the Scandi grinds before heat treat, and then after heat treat I finish freehand on the slack belt, and that gives me a Scandivex edge. Now then, stamping. I stamp my blades using some steel stamps and a hammer. A lot of folks condemn stamping because it induces stress risers, and yeah, to an extent it does. I have a normalizing cycle in my heat treat, and I don't know this for a fact, but it gives me pretty good peace of mind as far as the integrity of the steel in my knives, even after stamping. A lot of other folks prefer to etch their knives. If I could afford an etching machine, you bet that's what I'd be doing. But I can't afford one just yet. So, now we'll move on to heat treatment. My heat treat was derived from Kevin Cashin's website. Kevin Cashin is a American Bladesmith Society master smith, and he really likes to focus on the metallurgical aspects of knife making, and he's really good at what he does. And he's got a whole page devoted to heat treating 01 tool steel, which is what I use. But before I actually begin the heat treating process, I prep the knives. I sand off all the die, and then I bring the knife up to at least 120 grit or higher if it's going to be a polished finished knife. The next thing that I do is I normalize the blades. Normalizing will be familiar to those of you that hammer forge. It's a type of stress relieving, but it's above and beyond the standard stress relief cycle. Those are just in my words. I'm not a textbook, so normalizing is critical for hammer forging knives. It is not critical for stock removal. Now you should, if you're going to be stock removing blades, you should be doing at least a stress relieving cycle. Stress relieving does not occur at such a high temperature as normalizing does, but one or the other is necessary if you're going to be making knives. And the reason for this is when you're forging, you're inducing different kinds of stress into the steel because it's being heated, hammered, and cooling off. Heated, hammered, and cooling off dozens of times. When you're grinding knives out of stock, all of this up here is being exposed to more heat than maybe this back here, and it's important to redistribute the properties of the steel correctly, and to just kind of clean up the grain structure, which is really what you're striving to do when you normalize. Many times I'll triple normalize because it's good for the steel. Can't hurt it. Next step is austenitizing. Austenitizing occurs before you quench. It's the step where you bring the blade up to above critical temp and you let it soak. Different steels require different temperatures and soak times. I soak for 30 minutes. It's important to know the soak time for your steel. You're not going to get the most out of your steel if you do not soak it properly. After it's soaked for the allotted amount of time, it's pulled and quickly quenched. My quenching is preheated to between 130 and 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and I use Chevron 70. And you want to quench long enough too. You want to make sure that you're not just dunking it and then pulling it back out and throwing it aside. So do some research if you're looking to heat treat your own blades, and make sure you know how you should be quenching them or what temperatures that you should be using, etc. The next step is tempering. I triple temper my blades. Again, you can find that information on Kevin Cashin's website. Each cycle that I use is 2 hours long, and from what I've read, more cycles are better than longer cycles. So, is it better to have 3 1-hour cycles or 3 2-hour cycles? I'm not an expert, but I don't think it's going to hurt. 2-hour cycles, triple tempered. I'm quickly approaching, the diminishing returns, but I know that I'm getting the most out of my steel. So again, if you're looking into heat treating your own blades, it's important to make sure that you know what you're doing, especially if you're going to be selling them. There are companies out there to which you can send your blades and have them heat treated. It is not cheap, but if you're not ready to drop the investment for a kiln, by the way, I use an even heat kiln, then by all means you can send off your blades and have them treated. My first dozen or more blades were heat treated by Peter's Heat Treat in Pennsylvania, and they do excellent work. So anyway, let's
Alright, so before we get started, I'm gonna kind of talk to you a little bit about what's going on and how I grind my Scandi and Scandivex edges before heat treat. Okay, I grind Scandi and Scandivex the same way prior to heat treat, and the reason for that is this flat that I leave on the edge here. After the heat treat, I'll come back with a Scandi edge. If it's supposed to be Scandivex, I'll come back and I'll finish it up here by hand. Alright. Scandis start out the same way, and that's with this holder. You can call it a jig if you want to. And I just made this for this batch. I've actually not finished a batch with something like this before. And this is a standard Grizzly 1015 grinder. But what I've done is I've replaced, not really replaced, but I've refinished the platen. I took off and sanded off the tape, the low friction tape that was on the platen, and I've used JB weld and a couple of machine bolts at the bottom to affix a piece of Pyrex, and this has worked really well so far. It generates less heat, and that means, less heat generated here between the belt and the platen means less heat transferred to your blank, and it lasts much longer and stays much truer. There are some marks on it from the belt itself, but it actually hasn't began to dish out or anything. Another thing that I've done to this grinder is the standard tool rest is up under here. I've drilled it and tapped it, and I applied this 1/2 inch piece of just mild steel. I trued it up with some sandpaper and a flat block, and then I took a notch out in the front here. With this tool rest is much better than the standard tool rest, which is about the size of a credit card. So all we're going to do here is take this jig or this holder that I've made out of two pieces of angle iron and a couple of bolts and a couple of nuts. And the way I've done this is it's clamped in here, and then I've made a few back spacers out of some scrap. The back spacer that I use is the same size as the steel stock that I use. So I've got a couple of them over there in different sizes. And all we're going to do is, you can see that this one's already been through one grip. That's a 36 grip. This is a 60, and before heat treat I'll finish this out with a 120. And all we're going to do is, once we turn this thing on, is we're going to easily guide it over the belt. And as you guide it over the belt, you pull the handle away from the belt so that you can get the tip a little more consistent. Now this knife is going to be a Scandivex knife, so this is the only time that this jig is going to be used on this particular knife. Alright, one other thing about grinding. I know it's about the third time that I've said that, but you can't really run a grinder or do any of the other really concentration intensive tasks in knife making absent-mindedly. So if you can't concentrate, or if there's something going on in your life that you cannot focus on what you're doing, especially with the grinder or anything else that could really hurt you, like the drill press, you can't afford to do that stuff absent-mindedly. And I've referenced Loveless before in this video, and he mentions that if you've got something going on at home or whatever, you need to be able to go take care of that before you come out here and you work. 1, you can ruin what you're working on. 2, you can ruin your hands or your eyes. You gotta be here to do this. Another thing, if you get your edge too fine before you go to do your heat treat, unless you want to start all over, you can take this belt and you can very gently knock off that edge that you've already got. Now, does that have problems of its own? Yes, you can dish out part of your edge, and that ruins your blank altogether. But this blank is slightly oversized, maybe by a 32nd of an inch on every line to begin with, because all of these lines are going to be ground again when the knife is almost finished. So take that into account. If you get too much of an edge prior to your heat treat, don't freak out about it. All you got to do is you got to knock it off somehow. You can do that with a file. You can do it on a stone. But if you're going to grind your edges before heat treat, make sure they're not sharp. Next step, after we've ground our edge prior to heat treat, is stamping your maker's mark. Now, this is only if you're going to stamp. If you're using an etching machine, it's recommended, I don't know by who, but this is just the way that I would do it, that you do your etching after you've applied your finish and before you apply your handles. That way, if your etch doesn't come out correctly, you can sand it off. It's much easier to do before you apply your handles. So, the way that I run my stamps, I use this cheapo Harbor Freight Arbor Press and these steel stamps. And we start out with a C, and I don't like to get them too close to the spine. I don't think it looks good, and then something in the back of my mind says it might cause a more serious stress riser. I don't know if any of that's true, but another thing that I do is I try to keep the stamp tip-wise of the plunge lines. These handles on this specific knife are going to come up to about here. And that seems like it's a no-brainer kind of thing, but you don't, if that stamp's real close to the handle, it also doesn't look real good, unless it's a Ricasso stamp or Ricasso etch. My stamps, I try to keep them right about here. And they're hand stamped, so they're not perfectly consistent, but I like the way they look, and they're easy to read, and they don't wear off. Make sure your stamp's plumb. And then I take a blacksmith's hammer while I'm not really pushing, I'm just keeping it steady. I drop the hammer right on it. And that gives me a nice crisp stamp. I don't know how well you can see that, but it's there. There'll be close-ups at the end of the series. So we've got our C, now let's do our G. And the second stamp, or any other stamp after the first stamp, it's not as touch and go as the first stamp in a series. Trying to keep them plumb, trying to keep them in a nice little line can be kind of annoying sometimes. Alright, we got our set. I'm going to recheck that. That looks better. Got her set, and we'll drop the hammer on it. Alright, and that's our stamp. It's simple C and a G. These knives are ready to be sanded and then heat treated. Sanding your blanks. It is recommended by folks like Peter's Heat Treat and other guys. If you talk about heat treating your blanks, you want to sand off anything crazy that you got going on, like burrs. It's okay to have corners because that's going to be there, but you don't want a whole bunch of burrs because they're going to harden and they're going to be harder to remove later. So all I do is I take this is a machine surface and 120 grit paper. Most of these are going to be satin finish, or excuse me, heat treat finish blades. 2 of these are going to be satin finish. So all I do is I take it on a machine surface. And I just glide it back and forth. Now another thing that this does is, even though you've chamfered these holes, there are little bitty burrs on them. This gets rid of those burrs. And you can actually hear it when that burr is gone. All right. And I just give it a few easy passes on the spine and on the front of the handle. And that's that. This one's ready to go in the kiln. Alright, another step in heat treat prep that I didn't mention is ensuring that the blades are straight. It's a lot easier to straighten out an annealed piece of steel than it is a hardened piece of steel. And there's a lot less risk of a catastrophic failure. Again, I use this machine surface, make sure it's clean. Not got a bunch of dust on it. Same thing with the blade after I've sanded it to get all the burrs off of anywhere around the holes or whatever. I just lay it down. That looks pretty good. It looks good. Another word on straightening blades. I've heard a couple folks talk about being able to straighten a blade right after you quench it, and all that may be true, but it seems to me that would be an unnecessary risk when you can just ensure that the blades are straight. Now, some guys have an issue with their blades warping when they quench them. I have not found that to be a big problem. Just ensuring that all your temperatures are straight and making sure that you don't have any crazy grinds going on as far as like really lopsided or what have you. I've not found that to be an issue. Alright, let's check the focus right quick. That looks good. Alright, so now we're going to get into heat treating. A couple things. There are several methods to performing a heat treat. Talking about forges or kilns, or I've seen some guys like Gaw Custom up in Canada. I believe he uses, or at least he did use, a propane torch or a matte torch, and he made some pretty nice knives. But what I use is a kiln, specifically an even heat. I think this is a KF18 model. Yeah, KF18 with a ramp master. And when it comes to kilns, I think they are the absolute most consistent method for heat treating. This is a purpose-made knife maker's kiln. Think of a pottery kiln, but they've redone the inside of it is built just to accommodate blades. The computers on your kilns, they've got a real simple version. I don't remember what it's called, but it's you just set the temp and you let it run. This one is a little more complicated, but really all it does is it allows me to program it. I've got a sheet up behind the kiln. I don't know if you can see it from where you're at. Yeah, you can barely see the bottom of it up here. This sheet up here, that's my programs, and it outlines the programs in a way that I can just see it and know which program to punch in. I like that, and it's very convenient. Now, the importance of heat treating. Heat treat is probably the single most critical thing in knife making, as far as making a quality knife. You know, even if you got a knife made out of you know, S35 VN, if it's not got a good heat treat, then it's not going to do well. You know, the steel, the only way to get the most out of your steel is to heat treat it properly. And I use 01 tool steel. And the first thing that we're going to do here is we're going to normalize. You can also think of this as a stress release cycle. But in my opinion, it's above and beyond a standard stress release cycle. So we're going to collect up our blanks over here, off camera. Alright. And there's no limit to how many blanks you can normalize at a time, and it goes the same way with tempering. Now, when you're actually going to be quenching your blades for your austenitizing cycle, what I've read and what I do myself is no more than about 3 at a time, because you're going to be opening and closing your kiln to dunk your blades, and that can get hairy real fast if you don't keep it below about 3 blades. So what I have in here is just it's a ceramic stand, also made by Even Heat. I think there are a couple other companies that make these, and this is really nice because it just keeps your blanks from falling down the whole time. And I've been there. When I first got my kiln, I couldn't really afford a stand. Not that they're expensive, but money was tight. And all it does is it allows you to place these blades in here without having to stand them up on their spines. I was doing this number right here for several months because I just didn't have a stand. So all we're going to do is we're going to slide all our blanks in here. I don't prefer them to touch at any time when I'm heat treating. And then if you run out of stand space, one thing that you can do is you can also set them on top of the posts, and that works just fine. So we've got all of our blanks in here, and all we're going to do is the normalizing cycle that I use for 01 is 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. That's 1600 degrees Fahrenheit. And after the cycle is completed on the computer, what we're going to do is I'm just going to open it and let it cool in still air. Sometimes I don't even open it. I'll just let it cool overnight. And that may be what I do tonight, because I don't believe I'm going to have the time to actually go through and quench all of these. So with the Ramp Master, I've already got all of my programs in. And if you've got, I can go over in another video if you'd like me to on how to program the Ramp Master. There are other videos out there that go over that. But I'm going to go over just recalling a program and starting it up. You got 2 buttons right here: develop your programs, and then recall or recall. And that pulls your program out of the computer and sets it up to run it. So I'm going to hit recall to enter. Okay, now it's programmed to run my normalizing cycle. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to shut this, and I'm going to hit run. This might take 30 minutes to get up to temp. It might not take that long. It might take longer. The ambient temp in there when I started was about 61, 62 or something, 61. And it'll ramp right up to 1600 degrees. And the way I've got it programmed is it'll stop when it hits 1600 degrees. The program will stop, and the kiln will just go back to reading ambient temperature inside. Well, it's not ambient, but it'll go back to reading the temperature inside, but it's not actually putting heat in. So I'm probably going to let this stay overnight. That way I get as good of a normalizing cycle as I can. And then I'll come back tomorrow morning, or no, not tomorrow morning because I will be out of town tomorrow. But we'll come back Monday morning and we'll go over quenching. We'll go over the austenitizing and then the quenching, and then we'll get into tempering cycles. Again, that temperature that I'm normalizing at is 1600 degrees Fahrenheit.